James Mitchell had been dreaming of this moment for months. After saving every penny from his job as a warehouse supervisor, he finally had enough money to buy his first brand new car. At 42 years old, James had always driven second-hand vehicles that broke down more often than they worked. Today was different. Today he would walk into Henderson Motors, the biggest car dealership in Manchester, and drive out with a shiny new sedan. The morning sun cast long shadows across the dealership's polished floors as James pushed through the glass doors. He wore his best suit, the navy blue one he saved for special occasions, and carried a leather briefcase containing all his financial documents. His heart raced with excitement as he looked at the rows of gleaming vehicles under the bright showroom lights. "Can I help you?" asked a young salesman with perfectly styled hair and an expensive watch. The man's eyes quickly scanned James from head to toe, taking in his modest appearance and slightly worn shoes. "Yes, I'm interested in buying a new car," James replied with a warm smile. "I've been saving up and I'm ready to make a purchase today." The salesman's expression shifted slightly. "What kind of budget are we working with?" he asked, his tone becoming more distant. James opened his briefcase and pulled out a bank statement. "I have £25,000 in cash, ready to pay today." The young salesman glanced at the document but seemed unimpressed. "Right. Well, let me show you some of our more affordable options," he said, leading James toward the back corner of the showroom where older, less attractive models were displayed. As they walked past the premium vehicles, James stopped in front of a beautiful silver sedan. The price tag read £23,000. "What about this one?" he asked, running his hand along the smooth surface. The salesman looked uncomfortable. "Oh, that's probably not suitable for you. It's quite expensive, and there are additional fees and requirements." James frowned. The car was well within his budget, and he had excellent credit. "I don't understand. I have the money right here, and my credit score is over 800. "Look, mate," the salesman said, his professional mask slipping slightly. "Maybe you should consider something more realistic for someone in your position." The comment stung, but James maintained his composure. He had faced subtle discrimination before, but never so blatantly. "My position? I'm a paying customer with cash in hand." Their conversation attracted the attention of other salespeople who began whispering among themselves. James noticed several customers, all dressed more expensively than he was, receiving much warmer treatment from other staff members. "I'd like to speak with your manager," James said firmly. The salesman sighed dramatically. "Fine, but he's going to tell you the same thing." He disappeared into a back office and returned moments later with a tall, aggressive-looking man in an expensive suit. "I'm Derek Hartwell, the sales manager," the man announced without offering to shake hands. "I understand you're having some unrealistic expectations about our vehicles." James felt his patience wearing thin. "I'm not sure what you mean. I want to buy that silver sedan, and I have the money to pay for it in full today." Derek looked at James with obvious disdain. "Listen, we run a respectable business here. Our cars are for serious buyers who can actually afford them long term. We don't want people taking on debt they can't handle just to show off." "But I'm paying cash," James repeated, his voice rising slightly. "No financing needed." "Cash?" Derek laughed mockingly. "Right, and I suppose you earned all that money completely legitimately?" The implication hit James like a slap. Around them, other customers and staff had stopped to watch the unfolding drama. James felt heat rising in his cheeks, but he tried to remain professional. "I work hard for my money just like anyone else," he said quietly. "I've been saving for 2 years to buy a reliable car. I don't understand why that's so difficult to believe." Derek stepped closer, his voice dropping to a threatening whisper. "Look, I don't know what kind of game you're playing, but we don't serve your type here. This is a legitimate business, not some back-alley used car lot." James couldn't believe what he was hearing. In 2023, in a major city like Manchester, he was being refused service based on nothing but assumptions about his background and appearance. "My type?" James asked, his voice steady despite his anger. "And what type would that be exactly?" Derek's face reddened. "Don't play games with me," You know exactly what I mean. We cater to professional clients, not people people who might have gotten their money through questionable means. The accusation hung in the air like poison. James felt every eye in the showroom on him. Some customers looked embarrassed by the scene, while others seemed to agree with the manager's assessment. "I demand to see the owner," James said, his voice shaking with controlled fury. "The owner trusts me to handle situations like this," Derek replied smugly, "and my decision is final. I think it would be best if you left now." James stood his ground. "I'm not leaving until someone explains to me why a man with cash in hand can't buy a car from your establishment." Derek's face twisted with rage. "Right. That's it. Security." Two large men in uniform appeared as if from nowhere. James realized this had been planned from the moment he walked in. They had profiled him, judged him, and decided he wasn't worthy of their business. "I'm not causing any trouble," James said to the security guards. "I'm a customer trying to make a purchase." "Not anymore, you're not," Derek snarled. "You're trespassing on private property, and I want you removed immediately." The security guards looked uncomfortable but followed their boss's orders. "Sir, we're going to have to ask you to leave," one of them said apologetically. James looked around the showroom one more time. Every person there had witnessed his humiliation. He carefully placed his documents back in his briefcase and walked toward the door with as much dignity as he could muster. But Derek wasn't finished. As James reached the exit, the manager's voice boomed across the showroom. "And don't bother coming back. We know how to spot trouble when we see it." The final insult was too much. James turned back, his face burning with shame and anger. In that moment, something inside him changed. He had tried to be reasonable, patient, and professional. He had been met with prejudice, insults, and humiliation. As he stepped out into the Manchester morning, James Mitchell made a decision that would change everything. He wasn't going to let this stand. Derek Hartwell and Henderson Motors had picked the wrong person to humiliate. They had no idea what they had just unleashed. James sat in his old Ford outside Henderson Motors for several minutes, his hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles turned white. The humiliation burned in his chest like acid. He had been treated like a criminal, assumed to be dishonest, and thrown out like garbage, all because of how he looked and dressed. As he drove home to his small flat in Salford, James's mind raced. Most people would have gone home, complained to friends, maybe written an angry review online. But James Mitchell wasn't most people. What Derek Hartwell didn't know was that James had spent 10 years in the British Army, serving 3 tours in Afghanistan. He had learned patience, strategy, and most importantly, how to plan operations that achieved maximum impact. That evening, James opened his laptop and began researching. He started with Henderson Motors, learning everything he could about their business. The dealership had been family-owned for 30 years, but was struggling financially. They had expanded too quickly, taken on too much debt, and were desperately trying to maintain their upscale image to attract wealthy customers. Derek Hartwell, the sales manager who had humiliated him, was a different story entirely. Social media revealed a man obsessed with luxury and status. His Instagram showed expensive holidays, designer clothes, and a lifestyle that seemed far beyond what a car dealership manager should afford. More interestingly, Derek frequently posted about his gambling wins at Manchester's exclusive poker clubs. James dug deeper. Public records showed that Derek had been in financial trouble before, with county court judgments for unpaid debts. Yet somehow, he was living like a millionaire. James's military training kicked in as he built a complete picture of his target. The next morning, James called in sick to work. He had vacation time saved up and decided to use it for something more important than rest. He dressed in his most expensive clothes, borrowed a luxury watch from his brother, and drove to the most exclusive car dealership in Manchester city centre. At Prestige Motors, the treatment was completely different. The moment he walked in, a well-dressed salesman greeted him warmly, offered him coffee, and showed him their finest vehicles. James played the part perfectly, claiming to be a successful business owner looking to buy multiple cars for his company. I'm particularly interested in your most exclusive models, James told the salesman, whose name was Richard. Money is no object, but I do have very specific requirements about the dealership I work with. Richard's eyes lit up at the prospect of a major sale. Of course, sir. What kind of requirements? James leaned in conspiratorially. I've heard some terrible stories about car dealerships treating customers poorly based on appearance. I can't risk associating my business with that kind of establishment. Do you know Henderson Motors? Richard's expression changed slightly. Yes, I know them. They're struggling quite badly, actually. The owner, Mr. Henderson, is a good man, but some of his staff? He trailed off diplomatically. Oh? What do you mean? James asked innocently. Well, I shouldn't gossip, but their sales manager, Derek Hartwell, has quite a reputation. Several customers have complained about discriminatory treatment. There are whispers in the industry about his methods. James pretended to look shocked. That's exactly what I'm afraid of. A business reputation can be destroyed by one bad employee. Absolutely right, Richard agreed. In fact, there's been talk that Henderson Motors might not survive much longer. They've lost several major contracts recently, and word gets around in this business. James spent another hour at Prestige Motors, gathering intelligence about the industry and Henderson Motors specifically. He learned that car dealerships depended heavily on customer reviews, manufacturer relationships, and word-of-mouth reputation. A few well-placed complaints could cause serious damage. That afternoon, James visited the local library and used their computers to create several different email accounts. He began documenting his experience at Henderson Motors in detail, including dates, times, and witnesses. His military training had taught him the importance of thorough documentation, but James wasn't planning a simple complaint. He was planning something much more sophisticated. He started by researching consumer protection laws and anti-discrimination regulations. As it turned out, what Derek had done wasn't just morally wrong, it was potentially illegal under the Equality Act 2010. The dealership could face serious legal consequences if the right pressure was applied. James also discovered that Henderson Motors held several important manufacturer contracts. Car companies were increasingly sensitive about their dealers' reputations, especially regarding discrimination. A few well-documented complaints could jeopardize those relationships. Over the following days, James put his plan into action. He contacted Citizens Advice Bureau, filing a formal complaint about discriminatory treatment. He reached out to the motor trade press, sharing his story with journalists who specialized in industry scandals. He researched every review platform and consumer rights website, preparing to tell his story far and wide. But the masterstroke came when James discovered Derek's social media posts about gambling. Screenshots showed Derek bragging about winning thousands of pounds at poker games, often on worknights. For a car dealership manager, this raised serious questions about professionalism and financial stability. James created a detailed timeline of Derek's social media activity, cross-referencing it with business hours at Henderson Motors. The pattern was clear. Derek was gambling regularly during work time, often posting photos from casino bathrooms or poker tables during business hours. Meanwhile, James began reaching out to other customers who had visited Henderson Motors. Using social media and local forums, he found several people who had experienced similar treatment. A young single mother had been refused a test drive despite having excellent credit. An elderly Sikh gentleman had been ignored for over an hour, while white customers were served immediately. These weren't isolated incidents. There was a pattern of discrimination at Henderson Motors, and Derek Hartwell was at the center of it. James compiled everything into a comprehensive dossier. Photos, screenshots, witness statements, financial records, and legal precedents. He had enough evidence to destroy Derek's career and seriously damage Henderson Motors' reputation. But he wanted more than just revenge. James wanted justice, and he wanted Derek to understand exactly what he had done wrong. Simply exposing him wouldn't be enough. Derek needed to experience the same humiliation he had inflicted on others. As James put the finishing touches on his plan, he smiled for the first time since that terrible morning at the dealership. Derek Hartwell thought he was dealing with just another working-class man who could be pushed around and dismissed. He was about to discover just how wrong he could be. 2 weeks after his humiliation at Henderson Motors, James Mitchell was ready to execute the first phase of his plan. He had spent countless hours preparing, and now it was time to act. But first, he needed to gather more evidence, and that meant going back to the dealership. This time James looked completely different. He wore an expensive designer suit borrowed from his cousin who worked in London's financial district. A luxury watch glinted on his wrist, and he carried a leather briefcase that cost more than most people's monthly salary. His hair was freshly cut at an upscale barbershop, and he wore designer glasses that changed his entire appearance. When James walked into Henderson Motors, the transformation was remarkable. The same young salesman who had dismissed him 2 weeks earlier practically ran over to greet him. "Good morning, sir. Welcome to Henderson Motors. I'm Trevor, and I'd be delighted to help you find the perfect vehicle today." James smiled politely. "Thank you, Trevor. I'm looking for something quite specific. Perhaps several vehicles, actually. I run a successful consulting business, and I need to update my company fleet." Trevor's eyes widened with excitement. Multiple car sales meant a massive commission. "Excellent. Please let me show you our premium selection. Can I get you some coffee? Water? Perhaps something stronger?" The contrast with his previous treatment was so stark, it was almost comical. James was offered the same silver sedan he had wanted to buy 2 weeks earlier, but now Trevor was practically begging him to take it for a test drive. "This is one of our most popular models," Trevor gushed. "Very reliable, excellent fuel economy, and the financing options are incredibly flexible." "Actually, I prefer to pay cash," James said, watching Trevor's reaction. "Cash? How wonderful. That makes everything so much simpler. Derek, our sales manager, will want to personally handle a transaction of this size. Let me get him for you." Derek Hartwell emerged from his office with a broad smile, the same man who had accused James of criminal activity just 2 weeks before. He showed no recognition whatsoever. "Mr. Derek extended his hand warmly. "Johnson," James replied, shaking the man's hand. "David Johnson." "Pleasure to meet you, Mr. Johnson. I understand you're interested in multiple vehicles?" "Potentially," James said carefully. "But I have very high standards. I've had some terrible experiences with car dealerships in the past. Unprofessional staff, discriminatory treatment, that sort of thing." Derek nodded seriously. "I completely understand. We pride ourselves on treating every customer with respect and professionalism. That's what sets Henderson Motors apart from our competitors." James almost laughed at the irony but maintained his composure. "I'm glad to hear that. You see, I recently heard about an incident at this very dealership. A customer was refused service and thrown out, apparently based on his appearance. Quite shocking, really." Derek's smile faltered slightly. "I'm sure there must be some misunderstanding. We would never treat any customer inappropriately." "Oh, but there were witnesses," James continued casually. "Multiple people saw it happen. The customer was accused of criminal activity simply for wanting to buy a car. The sales manager was apparently quite aggressive about it." Derek's face was growing pale. I'm not aware of any such incident." "Really?" "Because I was told it happened just 2 weeks ago." "A man named James Mitchell, ring any bells?" The color drained completely from Derek's face. He stared at James more closely, beginning to see past the expensive disguise. "You're—" Derek started to speak but couldn't finish the sentence. "Yes, I'm James Mitchell," James said quietly, removing his designer glasses. "The same man you accused of being a criminal. The same man you had thrown out of your dealership for having the audacity to want to buy a car while working class." Derek looked around frantically, realizing that several customers and staff members were within earshot. The confrontation was happening in full view of everyone, just as his humiliation had been public 2 weeks earlier. "Now, Mr. Hartwell, you seem surprised to see me," James continued, his voice calm but carrying clearly across the showroom. "I'm curious. What's changed? 2 weeks ago, you were certain I was a criminal who had obtained my money through questionable means. Today, when you thought I was wealthy, you couldn't be more helpful. Trevor, the young salesman, looked confused and embarrassed. Other customers had stopped to listen, sensing drama unfolding. I think there's been a misunderstanding, Derek stammered, trying to regain control of the situation. Oh, there's been no misunderstanding, James replied. You profiled me based on my appearance, assumed I was dishonest, and had me forcibly removed from your premises. All because I didn't look like your idea of a successful person. Derek glanced around nervously, acutely aware that his business reputation was being destroyed in real time. Perhaps we could discuss this privately. Privately? Like you discussed it privately 2 weeks ago? James's voice carried a hint of steel. No, Mr. Hartwell. You made my humiliation public, so let's keep this public too. By now, a small crowd had gathered. Some customers looked shocked while staff members whispered among themselves. James noticed one customer discreetly filming with their phone. The truth is, Mr. Hartwell, I do have £25,000 to spend on a car. I did have excellent credit. I was a legitimate customer with legitimate money, earned through honest work, but you couldn't see past your own prejudices. Derek tried to salvage the situation. Look, if there was a misunderstanding, I'm sure we can work something out. Perhaps a discount on the vehicle you were interested in. James laughed coldly. Discount? You think this is about money? You publicly accused me of being a criminal. You had me physically removed from your premises. You humiliated me in front of dozens of people, and now you want to offer me a discount? The crowd was growing. Larger. James noticed that Trevor looked mortified, clearly realizing he had been part of the discriminatory treatment 2 weeks earlier. What I want, Mr. Hartwell, is for you to explain to everyone here why you treated me so differently, based solely on my appearance. Can you do that? Derek's mouth opened and closed like a fish out of water. He had no answer that wouldn't make the situation worse. You see, ladies and gentlemen, James addressed the crowd directly. This man runs a business that judges customers not on their ability to pay, not on their creditworthiness, not on their character, but on their clothes and their social class. The murmurs from the crowd were growing louder and more disapproving. James could see other customers beginning to back away from Derek and the dealership staff. I came here today to give you a chance to apologize, James continued. To acknowledge what you did wrong and commit to treating all customers fairly. Instead, you've proven that your discrimination is systematic and ongoing. Derek finally found his voice. Now see here, you can't just come in here and make accusations. Accusations? James pulled out his phone and showed Derek a photo. This is a picture of the security footage from 2 weeks ago. Would you like me to play the audio of you calling me a criminal? Derek's face went ashen. He hadn't realized that James might have evidence. So here's what's going to happen, Mr. Hartwell, James said, his voice carrying the authority of his military background. You're going to apologize to me publicly right here, right now. Then you're going to commit to treating all customers equally, regardless of how they look or dress. Derek looked around desperately, but there was nowhere to hide. The crowd was watching, phones were recording, and his reputation was crumbling by the second. The next few minutes would determine not just Derek's future, but the future of Henderson Motors itself. Derek Hartwell stood frozen in the middle of his showroom, surrounded by customers and staff who were all staring at him expectantly. The weight of his situation was finally sinking in. James Mitchell had outmaneuvered him completely, and now there was no escape. Derek stammered, but no words came out. His arrogant confidence had evaporated, replaced by panic and humiliation. James waited patiently, letting the silence stretch uncomfortably long. He had learned in the military that sometimes the most powerful weapon was simply allowing someone enough rope to hang themselves with. Finally, Derek found his voice. Look, if there was some kind of misunderstanding— Stop, James interrupted firmly. There was no misunderstanding. You made a conscious decision to judge me based on my appearance. You accused me of criminal activity with no evidence. You had me physically removed from your premises. Own up to what you did. Trevor, the young salesman, cleared his throat nervously. Derek, I think maybe you should— Shut up, Trevor, Derek snapped, his composure cracking completely. This is none of your business. The harsh response to his own employee in front of customers was another nail in Derek's coffin. Murmurs of disapproval rippled through the crowd. James seized on the moment. "Ladies and gentlemen, you're seeing Mr. Hartwell's true character right now. This is how he treats people when he's under pressure. Imagine how he treats customers who can't fight back." An elderly woman in the crowd spoke. I was thinking of buying a car here, but after seeing this," she shook her head and walked toward the exit. Derek watched in horror as several other potential customers began following her lead. Each person leaving represented thousands of pounds in lost sales. "Wait," Derek called out desperately. "Please, don't leave because of this. This person's lies." "Lies," James repeated loudly. "Are you calling me a liar, Mr. Hartwell? Because I have multiple witnesses who saw what happened. I have security footage. I have documentation of everything you said and did." Derek's face flushed red with anger and embarrassment. "You set me up. This is some kind of scam." The accusation backfired spectacularly. By suggesting James was running a scam, Derek was essentially admitting that he had treated him differently, based on appearance. Otherwise, why would the setup have worked? A setup? James smiled coldly. "Mr. Hartwell, all I did was dress nicely and walk into your dealership as a customer. The fact that you treated me completely differently proves my point exactly." A middle-aged man in an expensive suit stepped forward. "Excuse me, but I'm a journalist with the Manchester Evening News. Could I get a statement about what happened here?" Derek's eyes went wide with terror. Bad publicity could destroy Henderson Motors completely. No statements. This is private property." But it was too late. The journalist was already taking notes, and several people were filming with their phones. The story would be online within hours. James turned to address the crowd directly. 2 weeks ago, I came here with £25,000 in cash, ready to buy a car. I was treated like a criminal, accused of illegal activity, and thrown out. Today, wearing expensive clothes, I was treated like royalty for wanting to buy the same car with the same money. The crowd's reaction was visceral. People were shaking their heads, making disgusted noises, and several more were heading for the exit. "That's discrimination, plain and simple," James continued. "And it's illegal under British law. The Equality Act 2010 specifically prohibits this kind of treatment." Derek finally realized he needed to try damage control. "Look, I apologize if there was any misunderstanding. Perhaps we got off on the wrong foot." "There was no wrong foot," James cut him off. "There was prejudice, discrimination, and illegal behavior. The question now is what you're going to do about it." Derek looked around desperately, seeing his career and possibly the entire dealership's future hanging in the balance. What do you want?" James had been waiting for this moment. "First, I want a full public apology. Not some vague statement about misunderstandings, but an acknowledgement of exactly what you did wrong." Derek hesitated, but seeing the crowd's hostile expressions and the journalist's pen poised to write, he realized he had no choice. I apologize for my behavior 2 weeks ago. I made assumptions about you based on your appearance, and that was wrong." "Go on," James prompted. "I should not have questioned your ability to pay or suggested that your money was obtained illegally. I should not have had you removed from the premises." Derek's voice was barely above a whisper. "Louder," James demanded. "Everyone needs to hear this." Derek repeated his apology louder, his face burning with shame. "Second," James continued, "I want a written guarantee that this dealership will treat all customers equally, regardless of their appearance, background, or social class. This guarantee will be posted publicly and sent to all your manufacturer partners." Derek nodded miserably. He was trapped and knew it. "Third, I want you to personally undergo diversity and anti-discrimination training at your own expense." The crowd was watching this public humbling with fascination. Derek Hartwell, who had built his reputation on arrogance and superiority, was being systematically dismantled. "And finally," James said, "I want you to make a donation to a local charity that helps people from disadvantaged backgrounds. £5,000 should do it." Derek's mouth fell open. £5,000? That's about the same amount of commission you would have made if you had treated me properly 2 weeks ago," James finished. Consider it a learning tax. The journalist was writing furiously, capturing every detail of Derek's public downfall. Derek looked around the showroom. One more time. Half the customers had left. His staff were staring at him with a mixture of shock and disgust, and his reputation was in ruins. He had no choice but to agree to James's demands. "Fine," he said quietly. "I'll do it." "Excellent," James replied. "I'll expect the written policies within 48 hours, proof of the training enrollment within a week, and the charity donation within 2 weeks. If any of these deadlines are missed, this entire conversation will be shared with every automotive publication in the UK, along with evidence of your gambling during work hours." Derek's face went completely white. James knew about the gambling too. As James turned to leave, he paused and looked back at Derek one more time. "You know, Mr. Hartwell, if you had simply treated me with basic human decency 2 weeks ago, none of this would have been necessary. Remember that the next time you think about judging someone by their appearance." The crowd parted as James walked toward the exit, many people nodding approvingly at him as he passed. He had taken a stand not just for himself, but for everyone who had ever been discriminated against based on their appearance or background. Behind him, Derek Hartwell stood alone in his showroom, surrounded by the wreckage of his reputation and career. He had learned in the most painful way possible that appearances can indeed be deceiving, and that some people fight back. The next morning, James Mitchell woke up to find his phone buzzing with notifications. The video of Derek's public humiliation had gone viral overnight. Someone in the crowd had uploaded it to social media with the caption, "Car dealer gets instant karma for discrimination," and it had been shared thousands of times. James made himself a cup of tea and sat down to read the comments. The response was overwhelming. People were sharing their own stories of discrimination at car dealerships, retail stores, and restaurants. His stand against Derek had resonated with thousands of people who had faced similar treatment. The Manchester Evening News had published their story online at midnight, complete with quotes from witnesses and a detailed account of both incidents. The headline read, "Car dealers' discrimination exposed in dramatic confrontation." By morning, the story had been picked up by national newspapers and television news programs. But James's work was far from finished. While Derek's public humiliation was satisfying, he wanted to ensure that real change occurred. He spent the morning making phone calls and sending emails, putting pressure on all the right people. His first call was to Mercedes-Benz UK, one of Henderson Motors' biggest manufacturer partners. James explained the situation to their customer relations manager and sent them the viral video. Within hours, he received a response stating that they were deeply concerned about the allegations and would be conducting a formal review of their relationship with Henderson Motors. BMW and Audi followed suit after James contacted them with the same evidence. Car manufacturers were extremely protective of their brand images, and being associated with discrimination was a nightmare scenario for their marketing departments. Meanwhile, at Henderson Motors, Derek was facing the worst crisis of his career. The dealership's phone hadn't stopped ringing since the story broke, but instead of sales inquiries, they were getting angry calls from people who had seen the video. 3 major customers had already canceled their orders, representing tens of thousands of pounds in lost revenue. Old Mr. Henderson, the dealership's owner, arrived at work that morning to find reporters waiting outside his building. At 72 years old, he had built his business reputation over 3 decades, and now it was being destroyed by his sales manager's behavior. "Derek, my office." "Now," the old man said grimly as he walked through the showroom. Derek followed. His boss with the resignation of a man walking to his execution. He knew what was coming. 30 years, Mr. Henderson said, closing his office door. 30 years I've built this business, and you've destroyed it in 30 seconds. It's not as bad as it looks, Derek tried to argue, but his heart wasn't in it. Not as bad? The old man's voice shook with anger. 3 manufacturers are reviewing their contracts with us. We've lost major customers. Our reputation is in ruins, and all because you couldn't treat a paying customer with basic respect. Derek tried to explain his side of the story, but even he could see how pathetic his excuses sounded. "You're fired," Mr. Henderson said simply. Clear out your desk and leave immediately. I'll have security escort you out if necessary. As Derek packed his personal items, the entire dealership watched in silence. The same man who had thrown James out 2 weeks earlier was now being thrown out himself. But Derek's problems were just beginning. News of his firing spread quickly through Manchester's tight-knit automotive community. Other dealerships, warned by the viral video and news stories, wouldn't touch him. His reputation was toxic and no one wanted to risk association with discrimination scandals. James, meanwhile, was receiving calls from journalists, lawyers, and advocacy groups. The Equality and Human Rights Commission reached out to discuss his case as a potential example of systemic discrimination in the automotive industry. Several law firms offered to represent him in a discrimination lawsuit against Henderson Motors. More importantly, James's story was inspiring others to take action. A support group for victims of retail discrimination formed online, using his confrontation as a model for how to stand up to prejudicial treatment. The hashtag, "Treat Customers Equally," was trending on social media. 3 days after the confrontation, James received an unexpected visitor at his flat. Old Mr. Henderson stood at his door, hat in hand, looking every one of his 72 years. "Mr. Mitchell, I'm Harold Henderson. I own the dealership where you were mistreated." James invited the old man in and made him tea. Harold Henderson was nothing like his former sales manager. He was humble, apologetic, and genuinely distressed by what had happened. "I want to apologize personally for what Derek did," Harold said. "It goes against everything I believe in and everything my business was supposed to represent." "I appreciate that, Mr. Henderson," James replied. "But your apology, while meaningful, doesn't undo the damage that was done." "You're absolutely right," Harold agreed. "That's why I'm here. I want to make this right, not just with words, but with actions." The old man explained that he was implementing comprehensive changes at his dealership. All staff would undergo mandatory diversity training. Customer service policies would be rewritten to ensure equal treatment regardless of appearance or background. Most importantly, he was establishing a customer advocacy program to prevent discrimination from ever happening again. "I've also spoken with our manufacturer partners," Harold continued. "Instead of dropping us, they've agreed to work with us as a model for how dealerships should handle these issues. We're going to become an example of positive change." James was impressed by the old man's sincerity, but he wasn't finished yet. "That's all very good, Mr. Henderson. But what about the other customers who were discriminated against? Derek didn't just target me. This was a pattern of behavior." Harold nodded sadly. "You're right. We're reaching out to every customer who might have experienced similar treatment. We're offering apologies, refunds where appropriate, and free services to make amends." "And what about Derek's gambling during work hours?" James asked, testing how much the old man knew. Harold's face darkened. "We found evidence of that too. He was stealing time from the company while pursuing personal activities. If we hadn't fired him for discrimination, we would have fired him for that." James sat back, satisfied that justice was being served. But Harold wasn't finished. "There's something else, Mr. Mitchell. I know this doesn't undo what happened, but I'd like to offer you that car you originally wanted to buy. At cost price, no profit for us. And I'd like to hire you as a customer relations consultant to help us implement these changes properly." James was stunned. He had expected an apology, maybe some compensation, but this was far more than he had anticipated. "You want to hire me?" James asked. "Your military background, your strategic thinking, your ability to handle difficult situations. These are exactly the skills we need to rebuild our reputation and ensure this never happens again." James considered the offer carefully. It would mean working with the very dealership that had humiliated him, but it would also mean being part of the solution rather than just highlighting the problem. "I'll need complete authority over customer service policies," James said, "and I want regular reports on how customers are treated regardless of their appearance or background." "Done," Harold agreed immediately. "And I want Derek's donation to charity to go ahead as planned even though he's been fired." "Already arranged," Harold smiled. £5,000 to the Manchester Equality Trust. James shook the old man's hand. Sometimes the best revenge wasn't destroying your enemies. It was turning them into allies and making sure the injustice never happened to anyone else. Word of James's new role spread quickly through social media and local news. The man who had been discriminated against was now in charge of ensuring it never happened again. The story had come full circle, but there was still one more chapter to write. Derek Hartwell, meanwhile, was discovering that actions have consequences. Unable to find work in the automotive industry, he had been forced to take a minimum wage job at a call center. The man who had once looked down on working-class people was now living paycheck to paycheck himself. But the final twist in James's plan was yet to come, and it would teach Derek the most important lesson of all. 6 months had passed since the confrontation at Henderson Motors, and James Mitchell's life had changed dramatically. His new position as customer relations consultant had evolved into something much more significant. Under his guidance, Henderson Motors had become a model dealership for equality and customer service, attracting positive attention from across the automotive industry. James had implemented revolutionary changes. Mystery shoppers from diverse backgrounds regularly tested the dealership's service. Staff underwent monthly training sessions on unconscious bias and customer respect. Most importantly, a zero-tolerance policy for discrimination had been established, with immediate termination for any violations. The results were remarkable. Customer satisfaction scores had increased by 40%. Sales had actually improved as word spread about the dealership's commitment to treating everyone fairly. Several manufacturer awards had been won, and Harold Henderson's business was thriving like never before. But James hadn't forgotten about Derek Hartwell. Through his network of contacts in the automotive industry, he had been quietly monitoring Derek's situation. The former sales manager had struggled to find steady employment, moving from one low-paying job to another. His gambling debts had finally caught up with him, and he was facing serious financial difficulties. On a cold Tuesday morning in March, James was reviewing customer feedback reports when his assistant knocked on his office door. "Mr. Mitchell, there's someone here to see you. He doesn't have an appointment, but he says it's important." "Derek Hartwell?" James looked up, surprised. He hadn't expected Derek to show up voluntarily. "Send him in." Derek entered the office looking completely different from the arrogant man James had confronted 6 months earlier. His expensive suit had been replaced by worn jeans and a cheap jacket. He looked tired, defeated, and much older than his years. "Hello, James," Derek said quietly. "Thank you for seeing me." James gestured to a chair across from his desk. "What can I do for you, Derek?" Derek sat down heavily, struggling to find the right words. "I came to apologize. Really apologize this time, not the forced one you made me give in front of everyone." James leaned back in his chair, studying Derek's face. The man's arrogance had been completely stripped away by months of hardship. "I've had a lot of time to think about what I did," Derek continued. "About how I treated you and other customers. About the kind of person I became." He paused, his voice breaking slightly. "I was wrong. Completely, utterly wrong." James remained silent, letting Derek continue. "I lost everything because of my prejudices," Derek said. "My job, my reputation, my financial security. But the worst part is realizing how many people I hurt over the years. You weren't the first person I discriminated against. You were just the first one who fought back." Derek reached into his jacket and pulled out a crumpled envelope. "I know this doesn't make up for anything, but I wanted you to have this." James opened the envelope to find a handwritten letter, several pages long. It was a detailed account of Derek's discriminatory practices over the years, naming specific incidents and apologizing to customers he had mistreated. At the bottom was Derek's signature and a note. "For use in training programs, so others can learn from my mistakes. I've been attending counseling sessions," Derek continued, "trying to understand why I behaved the way I did. The counselor says it came from my own insecurities, my fear of not being important or successful enough. So I put other people down to make myself feel better." James was genuinely surprised by Derek's transformation. The broken man sitting across from him bore little resemblance to the arrogant bully from 6 months ago. "What do you want from me, Derek?" James asked. Nothing, Derek replied firmly. I don't deserve anything from you. I just wanted you to know that what you did changed me. Not just the public humiliation. That just made me angry at first. But watching how you handled everything afterward, how you turned a negative situation into positive change, it showed me what kind of person I should have been all along. Derek stood up to leave. I know you probably can't forgive me, and I understand that. But I wanted you to know that I'm different now. I'm trying to be better. James watched Derek walk toward the door, then called out, Derek, wait. Derek turned back, hope flickering in his eyes. The Manchester Equality Trust, the charity that received your £5,000 donation. They're looking for someone to speak at schools about discrimination and its consequences. Someone who's experienced both sides of the issue. Derek's eyes widened. You mean, it's volunteer work, unpaid, and it would mean admitting your mistakes publicly over and over again. But it might help kids avoid making the same choices you did. Derek nodded eagerly. I'll do it. Whatever it takes to make things right. James wrote down the contact information on a piece of paper. Tell them I recommended you, but be honest about everything. They'll only work with you if you're completely truthful about your past. Thank you, Derek said, his voice thick with emotion. I know I don't deserve another chance, but I promise I won't waste it. After Derek left, James sat in his office, thinking about the strange turn of events. He had set out for revenge but had somehow created redemption instead. The man who had humiliated him had been transformed by the experience into someone genuinely committed to fighting discrimination. That evening, James drove home in the silver sedan he had originally wanted to buy, the same car Derek had refused to sell him 6 months earlier. As he pulled into his driveway, his phone buzzed with a text message from Harold Henderson. Manufacturer Conference wants us to present our equality program to dealers nationwide. Your story is changing the entire industry. James smiled as he turned off the engine. Sometimes the best victories were the ones that helped everyone involved become better people. Derek's discrimination had led to his downfall, but it had also created an opportunity for growth, change, and redemption. The next morning, Derek Hartwell stood in front of a classroom of teenagers, telling his story with complete honesty. Spoke about privilege, prejudice, and the devastating consequences of judging people by their appearance. Most importantly, he told them about James Mitchell, the man who had taught him that true strength comes not from putting others down, but from lifting them up. In the end, both men had been transformed by their confrontation. James had discovered his power to create positive change, while Derek had learned the value of humility and respect. The discrimination that had started their conflict had ultimately led to understanding, growth, and a commitment to ensuring that others would never face the same injustice. The story of the British man who was punched and kicked out by a car dealership manager had become something much more powerful, a tale of justice, redemption, and the possibility that even the deepest prejudices can be overcome with patience, strategy, and the courage to stand up for what's right.